MusicalTalk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of MusicalTalk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and although I'm a huge fan of musical theatre, if you said the word Hamilton to me, I'll probably still first think of the motor racer. Well, don't get your hopes up, because despite that opening, today's episode is not about that most popular musical Hamilton, a show I've still yet to see. And in these terrible COVID times, the possibility of my doing so now seems further off than ever. Today, in fact, we're going to be talking about a show we've already discussed here, The House of Edgar. And if that name sounds familiar to you, and I hope it will, it's because it was the 2018 MusicalTalk pick of the Fringe, a show all about and around the life and legacy of Edgar Allan Poe, with a fantastic score by Thomas F Arnold. Now, the show came to Edinburgh in 2016 in an early version, and then returned in 2018 with a much enhanced version, which is the version I saw and loved, and was the version that we made pick of the Fringe that year. But I recently had the opportunity to sit down with the lovely Tom Arnold to talk about the future of that show and where it's going, because it's a show that really does have a future. And in the course of that really very charming conversation with Tom, who's such a good conversationalist in my opinion, we also then got onto the wider subject of our memories of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe over the last few years, because we are both avid attendees and always go annually, with the possible exception of this year for obvious reasons. So, in a minute you'll hear that conversation I conducted with Tom, which, as I say, discusses the generality of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe and just some of the feelings and experiences that those of us who go regularly have, and which are, I'm pleased to say, nearly always positive experiences. And before that, we'll explore the future of that fantastic Edinburgh show, The House of Edgar. But first, let's hear a song from that score by Tom. Enjoy.
Distinctly I remember a dark and cold December, when each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. With haste I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books relief of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore. For the rare and radiant maiden, who the angels named Lenore, it was then I heard a gentle rapping at my chamber door. Deep into the darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word Lenore. In there stepped a stately raven, summoned by the name Lenore, and it perched upon my chamber door and whispered, "Nevermore." The raven sitting lonely at my lintel did speak only that one word, as if her soul in that one word she did outpour. Nothing further than she uttered, not a feather than she fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow you will leave me, my hopes have flown before. You will leave me as she left me. Nevermore. Then I felt the air grow denser, like the aura of a spectre, and I heard the spirit's footfalls tinkle on the tufted floor. Wretch, thy God have lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee. Give me respite, give me mercy from my memories of Lenore. Spare me this mercy, so I forget my lost Lenore. Oh, spare me this mercy. Nevermore, nevermore. Leave no black bloom as a token for that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quoth the raven. Nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, and the lamplight, oh, her streaming, throws her shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow shall be lifted nevermore.
Well, I'd like to extend an enormous Musical Talk welcome to someone I consider to be a personal friend, but also is a friend of this programme because they have been on it already several times, because they were one of the people behind one of our favourite shows. In fact, one of our picks of the Fringe a few years ago, the House of Edgar, and that's Tom Arnold. Tom, it's lovely to be having you here today. How are you, first of all?
Hey, Thos, how's it going? It's lovely to be joining you here up in Edinburgh. The sun's shining here in the Pleasance Dome.
How did you get in?
Yes, exactly. No one else is here. I don't know why. It's bizarre, but it's lovely to be up here.
I think you must have misunderstood the nature of this virtual Edinburgh that we're talking about. Actually, let us talk a little bit about the show that really brought you to the attention of Musical Talk, which was the fantastic 5-star show, The House of Edgar, a few years ago. Would it be useful perhaps just to remind us all a bit about what that show was, what it was about, when it was, and sort of how it came to be?
Thank you very much, firstly, for all the support Musical Talk has given that show. So The House of Edgar was a show that we took up to the Edinburgh Fringe originally in 2016, and it's based on the life and works of Edgar Allan Poe. So it kind of starts off after Edgar Allan Poe's death and follows a man named Rufus Griswold, who is a real-life figure who spent much of his later life trashing Edgar's reputation. And so a lot of the sort of folk stories we now hear about Edgar Allan Poe, the idea that he was drunk, a womanizer, a lot of those actually come from Rufus Griswold. The two of them had this intense rivalry in life that largely seems to have come out of nowhere and is quite difficult to trace the exact origin of. So we came up with a show that was very much a fiction, very loosely inspired by this rivalry. And so the show followed Griswold as he first comes into Edgar's house after inheriting it after his death, and he's going through Edgar's books, and we would tell small Edgar Allan Poe short stories and poems in the form of little folk songs. So it was a really fun show to do. We did it in 2016. We brought it back in 2018.
I can remember Michael Gordon Shapiro,
Yes.
my friend and colleague and composer and fellow presenter. There we are. There's a CV in one. Raving about the show when he caught it in 2016, and then being delighted to see that it was on the agenda, as it were, in 2018, which is when I came along to see it.
Yes.
At Greenside in Nicholson Square, I think, or a sort of lovely Georgian space, which I thought fitted the atmosphere very nicely, because the great thing about the House of Edgar is the fact that it is full of atmosphere. It's actually almost the moment you take your seat, and there were performers already doing things, setting up in a very gentle way, setting up an atmosphere and a feeling, was that it was creating an atmosphere from the off, and an atmosphere of slight disturbance, slightly gothic unsettlement, if you like. Everything's slightly off beam and off kilter, and yet at the same time, the show as it developed with each of the vignettes fitted into the framework as you've described. Also, really, I thought it was able to be both sweet and touching when each of the vignettes required that, which isn't always the case with Poe, or unsettling in the extreme, and yet all those different flavours fitted perfectly into the tapestry of the show. It's odd to get that mix of emotional flavouring, if you like, in a pie.
Yeah, it was. We were very lucky both years we did it with the venues that we got that really matched the tone of it. The first year we were in Space on the Mile, which is up in the Radisson Blue Hotel, So we were just sort of off in this very small room off to the side.
Room.
Yeah, a little conference room up there with sort of that had light brackets on the walls on the way in and that kind of thing.
Yes.
And the sort of wood panelling, so that all fitted it wonderfully. And then, of course, when you saw it in Greenside at Nicholson Square, we had an audience on three sides, which just really added to that claustrophobia. I love playing to that sort of space. And the audience can all see each other as well as the performers. It's just really exciting.
I hadn't stopped to think about how the staging would affect that, but you're right. Being not quite in the round, but near as a promontory stage, if you like, I suppose, yes, does have that extra sense of looking in, but not just looking on, if that makes any kind of sense.
Oh, completely. I think you get a sense that you've almost trapped the show in a way. It's unlike a sort of end on. It's like an end on is like you're looking into a tank or something. You're looking into a completely different environment. Whereas your thrust staging is so claustrophobic. You've got them almost pinned on all three sides.
But I think that works in both directions, because I think that therefore the connection between the audience and what people are seeing on the stage is there's an increased intimacy. There's a reduction in that sort of Brechtian dissonance, one of my favourite phrases. You're much more connected and part of the piece, and therefore actually that might explain how those sort of emotional moods and flavours that you were generating and developing were able to filter out so thoroughly. It's the performance, if you like, is contained by the audience, but the audience is drawn in by the performance, and therefore we are all in the same arena in a strange sense, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I really do hope it had that effect, and it's lovely to hear that you took that away from it. Thank you so much.
Let's talk a little bit further about Edgar before we move on to other Edinburgh matters. Obviously, it was a big success in 2018 in particular, when it was in a further developed form, I think. The performances were crisp. The music, if I may say, Tom, and I know this one's coming your way, magnificent. Both in terms of composition and performance. Really, it was a lovely, wonderful show with a beautiful score. Everything meshed beautifully. And it was a development of the 2016. And I know that Mike spoke to you on both occasions, both years, and spoke about that development. But it seems sensible, perhaps now here in 2020, to talk about what's happened to it since and what might be happening to it in the future.
Yeah, so weirdly coming out of 2018, our takeaway from it was almost we felt the show was still in development, in a way, that there was still more we could do with it. When we were rewriting it for 2018, it had more plot, and we were struggling to fit that into the 1 hour Fringe format and the one act. And there was certainly a real sense when we were performing it, as towards the end of the show, it would be thundering through at such a pace to try and get to the end point it needed to in time. So recently we've been looking at it again, so I've been working really closely with Jack Dryden, who produced it both years, and Beth Clarence, who directed it the first year and also starred in the workshops we did of it in the second time we did it, to put together a 2-act version of it that we're hoping to workshop soon. Obviously, due to something about a virus, I don't know, something, I'm not entirely sure, but for some reason...
Circumstances beyond your control, I believe is the traditional phrase.
Yeah. But yeah, so unfortunately we haven't been able to get to that as quickly as we had hoped, but certainly we will be workshopping that in the near future with a view to performing this special new 2-act version of the show.
Can I ask you a question about the strangeness of this year? Because obviously there's a global pandemic, as you've quite rightly referred. Different countries have dealt with it in different ways, but many countries have taken the approach we've taken, which is essentially to go into lockdown or quarantine and slowly ease out of that. But it does mean that we had 3 or 4 months when most people were stuck in their own homes, whether working from home or not working from home. And that's a terrible dampener on real life. And as you say, it stopped the show being able to move on to a practical next step.
Yeah.
But did it actually give you extended development time in terms of thought and composition and writing? What I suppose I'm saying is, was there a silver lining to this? Did you say, right, if it doesn't look like quarantine's going to live for a couple of months, let's get our head down and do more on this? Or has it got to the point where actually it really does need a workshop to see if the development so far works?
So yeah, it was really useful to be able to sort of have that concentrated time with the script and with the songs, to the point that I'm still making edits and tweaks at the moment, and I'm sure I will be right up until workshops and long after. There's a lot of artists who talk about the fact that they don't feel like something's finished until the producer has pulled it from their hands and said, no, it's got to go on now. So I can imagine with this show, particularly because I've been tinkering with it since 2016, really, I'll always feel a bit like that with it. But it's been a very valuable time, yes, to be rewriting. The other thing that the lockdown really brought out was there's an idea at the heart of the show. It's a very metatextual show in that it talks a lot about stories and why we tell them and the value of that. And that weirdly became really sort of pressing at the forefront of my mind, a lot of my friends' minds, sort of in terms of the lockdown and the way we were all sort of using films and stuff as escapism, and then valuing that against everything else in life and finding that balance, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think it does. It's interesting. You've made a very good point, which I'd not stopped to think of there, but you're right. Everyone I've spoken to during the quarantine period, in a socially distanced and, in fact, let's be honest, entirely telephone or visual video call way, has been talking about the television or film they've been watching. And indeed, in a few cases, the films of performances, theatrical performances, but even that has to count as a film, I think.
Yeah, 100%. It's the thing that has brought us all together, and it's aside from the news, it's the other thing that we've all got in common that we can talk about. There was a reason Tiger King was huge at the beginning of the pandemic. It was a communal experience in that way. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that and bringing that into it.
It's interesting because it's ultimately it becomes about terminology and nomenclature. But we talk about it as we just had there. We said we've been talking about films or we've been talking about television, but actually the word that combines those is stories, because that's what they are.
100%.
This is fiction we're talking about. Very few people have got together and said, hey, I love that documentary on BBC Four or whatever. They may have done, but people aren't talking about documentaries in the way they are talking about ongoing drama series or one-off drama series or television, film, whatever it is. But it's all stories.
Exactly.
So I think that's such a beautiful parallel.
Yeah, it's a strange time, and I can't remember what play this is from, and I'm not going to be able to quote it perfectly, but there's a play that talks about the reason that our ancestors sort of all gathered round campfires to share stories wasn't anything to do with the stories themselves. It was the excuse to be together in that space. And a lot of people have been equating that to obviously what the theatre industry is going through at the moment. And that became something, taking it back to Edgar, that I was really thinking about writing that. Because Edgar Allan Poe seems to be a man who sunk himself into his writing to the expense of all his other sort of values in life, and lost sight in a way of the interaction and that sort of almost fundamental reason of why tell the stories in the first place, in order to be able to share them. So without wanting to get, too philosophical, it's that kind of idea that I've been thinking a lot about recently.
Well, no, I think you make a very good point there. I suppose what you're describing there, when creativity in his case became preeminent in his life, he became an introspective creator. Even though the product ultimately went outwards, he was immersing himself in his own creative process to the exclusion of others. Whereas actually taking us back to the other story you're talking about, that, early man, if you like, gathers around the fire to tell stories, is a form of extroverted creation. Even if the stories are already known and are just being retold, they're always told differently. So there's always some creativity in there. The response of an audience also adds creativity. So that's a communal creativity. It's the complete opposite of what Edgar Allan Poe, this individual, did. And actually, when it comes to authorship, there's a history of authorship discussion waiting to be told, but today is not going to be it. But you can see the move from collective storytelling to individual storytelling. We now put authors on pedestals and creators on pedestals as individuals rather than collaboratives. And yet we all know that theatre is an enormous collaborative art. So is television, so is film.
100%.
But you walk away from a film saying you know who the star is and you might know who the director was.
100%. And that collective aspect is where this virus really has hit the industry at its kind of core, is preventing people from collecting and being together and sharing that in that way. But yes, 100%.
Gosh, that's really interesting. But the good news is that there does look like there's a further future for Edgar.
Yes, certainly hope so.
And so obviously everything is yet to be determined, but the next stage, it sounds like, is workshops of the new 2-act version, essentially. Is that where we're at?
Yes, it is, yeah.
And obviously, I'm not going to ask you to give us a timescale because nobody quite knows what's going on and what will go on in the course of the next year, 2 years, 3 years. But would it ever be coming back to Edinburgh in a 2-act form? Or is the 2-act form actually not really suited for Edinburgh and you'd have to find other ways of putting it on? Or was it always intended that actually it wouldn't now go back to Edinburgh in its 2-act form? It is to the theatre in its less fringy self.
Yes, without wanting to jinx it, it's certainly looking more at the latter. The Fringe is brilliant and tailored to that kind of 1-act format. And I think it would be quite difficult, just due to loads of logistic things, of putting on a 2-act show in Edinburgh. A lot of people that go up there with shows that they've licensed that are written to be 2 acts end up performing them without an interval as if they were 1 act, but all the way through. And I think that can be quite exhausting for the audience. So the future for this show now is probably outside of Edinburgh.
There's also a pace issue. In exactly the way you've described. They don't just take out the interval, they do it at double speed sometimes and take out chunks, even though they're not always supposed to. I know that.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas actually, Edgar is all about building a sense of suspense, I think, and does so very successfully in its previous iterations. But you can't rush. Oh, it seems to me that you can't rush the building of a successful, suspenseful relationship. It seems to be one of the hardest kind of atmospheres to generate in the first place.
Yeah, 100%. And that's been one of the... Going to 2 acts and having the interval, that's... Obviously, we haven't been able to try it yet in a workshop at all, but that's going to be one of the most interesting bits to try and recapture, is how do you build that tension for an act and then let the audience go into a brightly lit bar for 20 minutes and then come back and go, oh no, we're back here. How do you carry that tension through that kind of gap? It's going to be really interesting and really fun to play with.
Do you know, yes, because that's one of the big format problems of any 2-act show, or indeed a 3-act show if you were going back to musical theatre of the early 20th century.
Yeah.
Exactly that. And there are 2 ways of doing it, aren't there? There's the interval either interrupts the 2-hour story you're telling, and so essentially you rejoin the action more or less where you left it at the end of Act 1, or Act 2 becomes, in a sense, a different chapter of the book, if you could look at it that way. So it becomes a second story which has grown on the first story. And that version, whilst making sense because it's able to make something of the punctuation, which is an interval, it acts as a sort of bookend for each of the acts, often results in second act trouble, the famous second act trouble, because second acts are almost invariably never as good as first acts.
Yeah.
The difficulty is if you're telling a 1-2 hour story and you're just putting an interval in, is that you're returning to the room you left where you left it, but of course you've lost the atmosphere, so you've got to rebuild it again. So the atmosphere profile is really difficult for that model, although that's better for a narrative. It's a more interesting narrative at one level, or rather it's a more responsive narrative to have the second act as a different story because you're making a virtue of the interval, but the second story is so rarely good that it's often a failure as a result.
Yeah.
I know that's not very helpful, not very helpful as a set of definitions, and of course there are other ways of doing it, but the interval is a terrible thing in some senses for a piece of theatre.
It's also it's an unwieldy part of story structure, given that we generally see stories in 3 acts. So the question then becomes, where do you put a break if you're splitting something that's been designed in 3 parts into 2 parts?
Yes.
Which is quite difficult to sort of structure with. I always really admire, particularly within the musical theatre canon, shows that make the interval kind of almost an essential part of its structure. So something like Into the Woods, that you could... It would be wrong to do without an interval. It's so essential that it has the 2 specific acts, and the 2 acts are very much comments on each other. It's shows like that I really admire, that make really good use of the 2-act structure.
You're right. It's the pre-Cinderella and post-Cinderella story, essentially, isn't it? And it's back to one of the 2 options I was describing. That is chapter 2 of the story because it's moved on.
Exactly.
And the interval acts in that way. Yes, you're right. It's not a continuum.
Yeah.
Whereas, I'm not going to ask you to reveal anything here, but Edgar feels, from its earlier versions, to have been a continuum story. So you've got different challenges, perhaps.
We were lucky. I mean, when we first started developing Edgar, we were students, with very lofty ambitions that it was going to be a big 2-act show. So developing the story, there was kind of a tipping point that happens halfway through without wanting to spoil anything.
Oh, good, right. So there is something.
So and that stayed in the show even when it got condensed to 1 hour. There's a real shift in status quo about halfway through the story. So we've been lucky that we've got that kind of linchpin still in there that we can use as a pivot. But it's going to be really exciting to try it, going back to 2 acts.
So we're saying that Edgar swings like a pendulum do, and probably in a pit, given it's Poe. But
oh, he's done it. He's landed it. Perfect.
Well, thank you and good night. But I think we should escape from that terrible observation of mine into the wider context of Edinburgh, because
yes,
this is something I'm really keen to explore this year when we don't have an Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And we at Musical Talk are creating this virtual Edinburgh Fringe where we talk about shows that we can see, or shows which are that have come from it and are being developed, like Edgar, things like that. But we so rarely, as a show, as in Musical Talk, ever talk about the Edinburgh Fringe experience in its holistic sense. It's always about, let's look at this show, let's look at this show, let's look at this show, and we never really talk about what it feels like to be in Edinburgh. Just, that's a very brutal and blunt way of putting it. But can you remember the first time you went to Edinburgh? Was it in 2016 for Edgar, or had you been previously, even as a punter or in some creative way or whatever?
So, I love the Fringe.
By the way, that's the right answer. Carry on.
Yes, nailed it. I went for the first time in 2015 for a long weekend up there. And just loved it immediately. And I have been back every subsequent year, whether that was when we were doing Edgar and with a show, or just as a punter. It's a really fun experience. It's completely it's unlike anything else, and it sort of, for me, has become a real part of the structure of the year. I'm sure you relate to that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's
the best week of the year, I think.
Oh, it's definitely up there. It's a wonderful time. Utterly bizarre and unlike anything else, really, as experiences go, and the level of exhaustion you get to, the amount of sheer story to almost process, because you'll end up seeing sort of 3 or 4 shows, or even north of that,
indeed,
in a day, and then still not quite have processed them fully until you get on, before going on to the next one, and it's only sort of in the weeks after you find yourself really thinking about all of them properly through.
Do you know, that's a really interesting point that you've made there, and it came to me in its flip side with the virtual Fringe, because this summer I've been watching a number of YouTube recorded versions of musical shows, and indeed you and I are going to be talking about them on another episode.
Yeah.
But I have said to myself, it's really important that I don't watch them one after the other, that I go off and make a cup of tea, and indeed maybe put it off for an hour before I go on to the second one, have lunch, go for a walk, whatever it is. Just do something to act as punctuation. And of course, when you're in Edinburgh proper, though you may be running from shows, it's 90% certain that it's not going to be in the same venue that you've been in. Very, very rarely do you leave a show and just go to the next door or rejoin the queue to come back into the same venue.
Yeah.
But actually, that running from one show, or walking, depending on how much time you've got,
yes,
it may only be 20 minutes. It quite often is. You see people running across Edinburgh all the time. I do it myself, and you know why they're doing it. They are doing it because the show they've been in has overrun by 3 minutes, and they've now only got 8 minutes to get to the other venue.
Yes.
But actually, that acts as punctuation. And funnily enough, punctuation is the best way of sealing an experience, either for the analysis immediately, or at least for later analysis, as you've been describing. To do it one after the other, I think, blurs it. So I think your idea that you take it away and you analyse it is absolutely correct. But you have to give yourself time to, if you like, process the data logistically, if not analytically. The brain has to seal it up and put it into its memory.
Oh, completely.
And I think that can only be done by sort of having an end, and that end is underlined by moving from one venue to another.
Yeah. No, 100%. Maybe that's the one thing I'm not missing this year, is the mad dashes across Edinburgh through all sorts of weather as well. It's always those cobbles in the rain, man.
Well, you say all sorts. It's mostly been raining these last.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Actually, as we're talking the Edinburgh experience, last year, 2019, was a particularly rainy Edinburgh. Now, I never mind that. I like the rain. I like it being cooler.
Yeah.
But I remember walking down Chamber Street, which is one of the, I always think, significant streets for the Fringe. It's where the old sea venue, now the House, is.
Oh, yes.
And that's always been a kind of central point for me, oddly enough. It's one of my lodestone points. I know where I am when I see Chamber Street. It's got the museum on the other side. It's a beautiful, broad thoroughfare. It's a lovely street in its own right. It's glamorous at any time of the year. You know, it's got statues and wide pavements, and it's good views and lovely architecture. Everything about it's fantastic. And I remember coming out and the skies had opened and I had to move from the House, the old sea venue, to a different venue. And there was so much water on the slightly inclined Chamber Street as I walked along it quite quickly that the drains were overwhelmed and the water was therefore staying on the street like glass. And of course everyone had left the street because they'd all gone into the museum or somewhere, gone to hide. So it was me alone in this magnificent street with the rain and on what looked like an ice rink. It was like there was an inch of water on the surfaces, which was glistening in the light, such as there was. It's not at all a story about theatre, but it is a story about an odd atmosphere, a kind of thing that you only sort of get in Edinburgh, and I don't know why that would be. That feels to me a very Edinburgh experience.
It's those moments, because we were talking about the fact that you are rushing everywhere, and it's when you get those weird moments of pause in the middle of it all, and they're always triggered by sort of the strangest of things as well, given the strange nature of the whole festival. Is it Chambers Street that the jazz bar is on the end of, on the corner there?
Yes, I think it is. That's exactly right. Near the Forbidden Planet part of the road it's on.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the jazz bar was I only discovered the jazz bar last year. I mean, obviously you can't recommend it to people this year, but in the future, go to the jazz bar. It's so cool. They have gigs until the wee small hours of the morning.
Which is a Sinatra song.
Yes, exactly. Who wrote that? Is it Cole Porter? I don't know.
No, it's not Cole Porter, but I'm afraid I don't know who did write it.
Yeah, I can't think who it was. I saw a gig there last year that might have been one of the weirdest but most fun things I've seen in Edinburgh, where a fusion band called the Quartet, a brilliant fusion band, played for 2.5 hours, only 3 songs. They were just really long medleys, each of them, of these new funk arrangements of John Williams theme tunes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and this was it was 1 a.m. or something crazy. Quite a bit of it's on YouTube. I'd really recommend checking it out. It's wild, but yeah, they were great. But the Jazz Bar is a really fun music venue if you're looking for a late night drink and some live music.
Well, if you're in Edinburgh and you're not, you've got to take a long, hard look at yourself and ask why.
Completely.
And just let us drop a fact in the wee small hours of the morning was written in 1955 by David Mann as composer and lyrics by Bob Hilliard. I've looked it up. So
there we are. There was somebody listening to this and shouting at their phone.
Oh, that happens a lot.
They were screaming at it. They knew it. Yeah.
So let us take you back then to 2015, your very first time at the Fringe. Is it rude to ask how old you were?
Oh, now you're testing me. I think I was 18 or 17.
Yeah. So in that region.
I think. Yeah.
So I suppose, how did you get there? By car, by train? And can you remember basically your first sort of steps into the Edinburgh atmosphere? And how, because I can remember mine, even though they were in 2007.
So in 2015, I went on the sleeper train, which is a weird experience because you wake up just in the middle of Waverley Station. And I hadn't been to Edinburgh before, let alone the Fringe. So I wasn't sort of familiar with what the city looked like or anything. So stepping out of Waverley Station and you are walking right into the heart of it. The old town is sort of looming over up on the hill, and the new town's behind you. And immediately people were trying to get us to take flyers just within first steps. It was, quite mad.
Really, as early as that? Because if you were coming into Waverley on a sleeper, that would have been about 7 o'clock in the morning.
I wonder whether I've merged it into a sort of more romantic view of the Fringe in my head. It all kind of merges into one.
Well, it does do that, yes.
Yeah. I remember it being a particularly sunny day as well. And so stepping out of Waverley Station, and as I said, you see the castle up on the hill and just the bright sunshine sort of behind it. It was quite something.
And let's talk about the atmosphere of the Fringe per se then, because you've mentioned the leafleters and the flyers and the Royal Mile, and I think there's a kind of tangible feel, because I had been to Edinburgh before I'd been to the Fringe and loved it as a city and been several times. But it has a very different feel during the non-Fringe weeks. I can remember that first time leaving Waverley Station exactly the way you've described, coming out into Market Street, joining up to Jeffreys Street, which takes up, right near the Tron at the bottom of the Royal Mile, or right in the middle of the Royal Mile, actually, but at the bottom in terms of the fringe area. I can remember it, I can tangibly feel the atmosphere, that there was sound. But, your senses are overwhelmed very quickly, I think. There's sound everywhere. There's people everywhere, even in the back streets. There's quite often a smell of food. It may not be the best quality food because there's an awful lot of hot dogs and hamburgers being sold. So there's that smell of cooking. There's bustle and hustle, and also people trying to live their own lives and get on. There are people doing their weekly shop as well as 4,000 people picking up leaflets. I find it intoxicating.
Yeah, no, there's also less so in the very centre, but sort of out in the meadows and that kind of thing. As you go slightly further out from the mile, there's the smell of brewing and hops that just lingers over the city all the time, particularly over that side of it. That's something we had when we did the show in 2018. Our accommodation was over that way, and that's now a smell that I always associate with Edinburgh, that smell of sort of malted hops and that kind of thing, because it just sort of sits over that whole area of the city. But yeah, it's, as you say, it's overwhelming. It's all senses at once, all the time for a week.
Now, you said you loved it almost immediately. Can you sort of put your finger on why? Is it just what we've just described there? Because there's more to it than the atmosphere, isn't there? Because there is the shows and the creativity which sort of pours out of all the walls.
There's a real excitement to it. Even just walking the mile. Certainly for the most part, you get the sense as well that everybody in that space is equally joyous. They're all they all want to be there. They're all wanting to sell their shows and are excited about what they're doing there. You get a sort of this palpable sense of communal joy throughout just everyone you come across there. It's very easy as well to talk to complete strangers while you're there.
Yes.
Completely off the cuff. In a way that it isn't kind of considered socially normal, as it were.
But you're right. I mean, there is a license to talk to anyone, isn't there? Even at the end of a show, because I do this. If I like a show and I want to interview someone to do with it, I hang around afterwards and just collar somebody, and nobody ever objects.
No.
And in a queue, when you're waiting to go in, you often find yourself talking to the people in front or behind you. Almost always the same conversation. Have you seen anything you'd like to recommend?
Yeah.
Am I in the queue for X?
Yes, and that's always fun as well, because then you get recommendations from completely outside of your wheelhouse.
Yeah.
And some of the best stuff I've seen has been things that I would never have come across, never have thought to see. And
what does that tell you about your own judgment, Tom?
Oh, yeah. No, that's... many people have said it.
Oh. But yes, you're right, that license to speak to people, and in the mile as well, because they want to speak to you. They want to encourage you to come to their shows, but quite often they also are just keen to talk about the shows and what they're doing more broadly. That's the performers here and the people flyering.
I guess there's an acceptance with it that comes with it as well, of just people go to the Fringe to do weirder shows for the most part as well, and there's an excitement that it's somewhere where your strange little idea for a piece is going to be embraced to an extent. It's a trial by fire, but there's an element of nobody's going to sort of judge you for thinking, oh, I thought I'd try this.
Do you know, I think that works in both directions, because I think it's a place where audiences are also more willing to try things they wouldn't try normally.
Yeah.
And I think partly that's the atmosphere and partly it's the price. If you've seen a show that actually ultimately was either terrible or just didn't ring your bell, you've probably only lost 10 quid or so.
Yeah, exactly. It's nowhere near the prices you're paying, certainly for London theatre and that kind of thing.
Indeed. I mean, obviously, you're only paying £10 for an hour show, something like that, so which is a remarkable value. I suppose that does lead me on to my next thing. I don't know if you get this. This sort of gets my goat a little bit, but I know where I work as the person who goes to the Fringe every year. And every year someone wants to say to me, oh, I'm going to the Fringe this year. What comics are you seeing? What comedians? And I say to them, I'm sorry, I really don't go to the Fringe for the comedians. If I want to watch the comedians, I'll just turn the television on, because they're all on various channels all the time, or their DVDs are available, or whatever it is. And that's fine, and it's lovely. But also, the comedians are the people who are still charging a damn sight more than any of the drama. I always find this very strange. And I'm not criticising them, and they're not charging their West End or Wembley Stadium prices. But, if you want to see a top-ranked comic, you're going to still be paying 25, 30 quid for a show often called Work in Progress.
Yes.
Whereas, you can see The House of Edgar, which is a fully written show with professional actors, with an orchestra, not just one person on a keyboard, not that there's anything wrong with that at all, for a tenner or something like that. And you suddenly think the value of, value of drama in both its social sense of value, but also its financial sense of drama in its widest form. I don't just mean musical theatre, but I mean plays, drama, musical theatre, all that entire family of dramatic fiction is stories, taking us back to earlier in the conversation, is still magnificent. And yet the much more commercial end of the Fringe, which of course is always going to be there, is fine if you want it, but that's not what it's about for me. And yet for so many people, it is exactly what it's about. They go to the Fringe to see 4 comedians. If you're lucky, you can drag them to a piece of drama as well. I feel, I'm not judging those people. It would be wrong of me to do so, but I fear that they are missing the best bits of the Fringe.
No, not at all. It's I definitely get what you mean. When you put it like that, I wonder if we're the ones who have got the economics of it wrong. You were saying it, and I was like, "Yeah, that is mad. We should be charging more." No.
Oh no, I've made you evil.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you get your big name headline comics up there who are playing huge venues, and a fair few of those shows are a fair bob. Every now and then somebody, like, I saw Mark Watson a couple of years ago, who I love, and he was doing 3 or 4 shows a day, and it was one of his last ones, and that, I'm pretty sure, was only sort of maybe 12 quid.
Oh, right, okay.
And that was excellent. Yes. And there's quite... And also the other nice thing about Edinburgh is it is a place for comedians who are trying to get their stripes, as it were. So you can see a lot of up-and-comers who maybe, aren't the Mock the Week headliners, maybe heading in that direction. And you can see them, and they're generally cheaper, and those are really fun shows. And those are the ones you see on that bus that's outside the Pleasance Dome, where you go and sit in there, and you'll see a stand-up for an evening and that kind of thing. And they're wonderful. But I do agree, people don't realise there's such a huge drama side to the Edinburgh Fringe. And it's a massive drama scene, doing loads of really exciting work, and every now and then, you get huge things come out of that. So Fleabag being an obvious example, or Six, these shows that, if it weren't for places like the Fringe, would struggle to find their market and their place to kind of exist within the entertainment scene. But yeah,
it is. You're right. It allows some acts to launch which you might find hard to believe would ever have got mainstream. I think possibly the best example of that, I mean, unfortunately their career is now finished, but Hinge and Bracket, I don't know if you're aware of Hinge and Bracket, but they won the Perrier Comedy Award in the 1970s.
Right.
They were essentially a double drag act. It's a double act, and they were both fellas dressed as women, and they sang. They were pretending to be retired opera stars, an opera star diva and a pianist accompanist.
Yeah.
A slightly over-the-top diva and her vinegary companion and accompanist. They were the big hit of the early 70s. They appeared on lots of variety programmes on television as a result of that. They're unlikely really to have hit the big time if it weren't having been spotted at Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And then because they actually sang these songs, they're the kind of drag act which is so realistic that it's very easy to believe that you are actually just watching 2 women with the characters you're being portrayed. So they would appear on Friday Night is Music Night on the radio, The Good Old Days, which was a variety programme. They turn up on chat shows and game shows. They eventually got their own sitcom.
Yeah.
They got 2 sitcoms on the radio and 1 on television. They did stage shows. They got bigger and bigger and bigger. They then started doing musical theatre. They sang a lot of Gershwin and Ivan Novello and Noel Coward. And they had a long career based on having been discovered. But you just think, it's got Edinburgh stamped all over it, that career.
Yeah, where would an act like that kind of find its base and its following? It's a really obscure idea, but it's kind of brilliant. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it really is. And also it goes to show that Edinburgh's been doing this for a long time.
It was a big anniversary last year, wasn't it? And I can't remember which one.
Well, I think it started in 1949, so you do the math, as I believe our American cousins will put it.
Carry the 1, and then... what is it?
I also know what you're quoting there. I believe you've just slipped... I think you've just slipped in a Toxic Avenger joke.
Yes. Oh, I hadn't realised I did it, but yes, I watched it last night.
As did I, as it happens. Well, we'll discuss that on a separate occasion.
Oh, absolutely.
The Edinburgh Fringe, then, it's obviously it draws you back in different forms as a creator, as a punter. You've done it every year that you can do it since 2015, and obviously, presumably, intend to carry on doing so, as I do. If you were trying to explain to someone, a listener of Musical Talk, why the Fringe was a worthwhile experience to try at least once in your life, how would you describe that? I mean, this is quite hard to boil it down to a sales pitch, but how might you do that?
There's a big question.
And you notice I've given it to you.
Edinburgh has everything you could possibly want when it comes to entertainment, and probably a lot of things you didn't realise you wanted to see as well.
That's beautiful.
It's just, you will surprise yourself in what you find to enjoy, and it will make you, in a way, almost reassess your own tastes and what you're interested in when it comes to performance and when it comes to entertainment. There's so many things I've seen that I never expected I would have enjoyed, and now I've found so much more stuff to watch as a result of it. So yeah, it's a kind of challenge yourself in the most fun way.
Yeah, I've never regretted anything I did in Edinburgh, even the terrible shows. And I'm not going to name names, but
oh, absolutely,
we will all have seen shows which we have loved and then have disappeared into the ether and leave almost no trace. And we'll all have seen shows which have been an absolute waste of an hour of our lives, and yet also become the fodder of anecdote. And I can tell you, I'm not going to give you the name, but the worst show I ever saw in my life was an hour and 20 minutes in Edinburgh. There were 6 of us in the audience, which was 6 too many. It was a one-man show.
Oh no.
And this poor person was trying his best, but he was just completely out of step with everything that Edinburgh was about, and it was terrible. I'm not going to go into any of the detail because it's not fair.
Yeah.
Suffice to say that I have been talking about that show privately with friends
for you.
ever since.
Yeah.
So it has become, even, as I say, even the bad experiences can be spun gold.
Oh, 100%. I can think of several shows that I haven't enjoyed but have caused endless amusement for us. Absolutely. Won't name names. Got to be careful.
Yep.
But yes.
Well, next time you and I meet in person, I'm going to buy you a big whiskey, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me everything.
Yes, that's an off-mic chat, definitely.
I mean, I think what we're both saying here, Tom, and we are converted, so it's very difficult for us to say anything other than what we've said, is that it's a magnificent experience that it's almost impossible not to enjoy. I mean, I think you'd really have to be a remarkable misanthropic old rotter not to enjoy the Edinburgh Fringe. And I'm rather hoping that if you are a misanthropic old rotter, you're not a regular listener of Musical Talk.
Shout out to all the misanthropic old rotters listening.
Yes.
My gang.
Please don't write in. But seriously, I think that we would recommend everyone tries Edinburgh at least once, with the sort of secret knowledge that if you do it once, you'll probably do it more than once. It really is intoxicating and sort of addictive, I think, in the best possible way. It's a legal high.
100%. I couldn't agree more with that. Absolutely.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for talking about, both your experiences in Edinburgh over the years, and also about the fantastic show, The House of Edgar. As I say, it was our pick of the Fringe in 2018, and the idea that it's going to get better and bigger and even more impressive is actually mouthwatering for me. So I do hope that we'll stay in contact to talk about that show as it starts to come to life in physical theatre in, we hope, the fairly near future.
Of course, absolutely. Thank you once again, Thos. This was great fun. Thank you for having me on.
Lovely. We'll do it again. Speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon. Cheers, Thos.
I am dreadfully nervous, but I am not mad. Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story.
When I first had the faintest of foulest of thoughts, unfeasible to say, but once lodged in the back of my restless brain, it would haunt me night and day. The old man never harmed no man, but it was by his hand that I thrived. Yet I took delight in the right to ensure that by night he would no longer survive.
He had never wronged me, he had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold.
Now this is the point, you fancy me mad. You would not judge if you saw how I planned. Madmen know nothing, they know not a jot. Nervous I may be, but a madman I'm not. Yes, manic I may be, but a madman I'm not. So for 7 nights by lantern light I hid outside his door, and the time was spent to sharpen senses, but fearless, nervous of the nearness of the task that I perform. Lantern aloft, I slowly pushed the lonely door aside. With disbelief I saw him wake from his sleep, his eyelids peeled back wide. Now this is the point, you fancy me mad. You would not judge if you saw how I planned. Madmen know nothing, they know not a jot. Nervous I may be, but a madman I'm not. Yes, manic I may be, but a madman I'm not. Subduing my pride, I knelt down by the side and gazed upon the source of my rage, of my pain, of my fear and disdain, of an evil cold and coarse. From his mouth came too late to conceal his fate a single final cry, as with his last living look he fixed me with that pale blue vulture's eye. His pulse rang like a drum beat of thudding bass and marching snare, and it faded into the distance as I entered the vulture's glare. The night waned, and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then tore up 3 planks from the flooring and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye,
not even his, could have detected anything wrong. As the bell sounded the hour, I heard a knocking at the door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I to fear? There entered 3 men, officers of the police, who said they had heard a shriek. I told them the old man was away in the country, and bade they search his house well.
Now this is the point, you fancy me mad. You would not judge if you saw how I... Like a pocket watch in cotton, the softest ticking caught my ear, and it rose like a double-time bass drum beat, marching ever near. And like a disease of pained unease took root deep in my gut. It seeped and spread and oozed and wept like a foul and festering cut. As it rose running red like cloyd clotting blood lumping back at the back of my throat, it mixed with the deafening dead man's pulse to produce a pounding note. The chaotic chord crescendo, it was the devil's art. I fell to my knees before the police, overwhelmed by his telltale heart.
And there we are, another song from the House of Edgar. The recordings you've heard today are from the 2016 version, but both these songs have made it into the 2018 version. And I'm very, very pleased. Particularly the last one. I love that song, which of course is from the Telltale Heart. And the songs really show off the versatility and skill of Thomas F Arnold. If you want to find out more about the House of Edgar, go along to the website Argosy Arts. And you'll be hearing more from Tom in a few weeks and months, because he and I have also had a chance to discuss some of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe shows which you could have seen online this summer as part of our virtual Ed Fringe. So keep your ears peeled for that. Any time spent in Tom's company is time well spent, in my opinion. And don't forget to tune in again to Musical Talk next week, when we'll be exploring the House of Edgar again, but this time, instead of looking to the future, we'll be remembering the past, because there'll be another chance to hear more songs from that wonderful score, plus an interview I conducted with 2 of the actors from that outstanding 2018 production. That's Sarah Dean and Owen McAndrew. And it's a lovely, playful, happy, cheerful conversation, which also gives plenty of insights into what it's like to put on a very successful show at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. So do join me again next week for that. However, in the time between this episode ending and you're listening to the next episode, I would suggest that you actually go off and do something else, rather than just remain sitting in an armchair or lying on a bed. After a week, you're bound to get very hungry, very thirsty, and frankly, the state of the bedsheets might really not be up to scratch. Sort yourself out, you slovenly idiot. And on that cheerful ending, I'm going to say goodbye to you. And to prove it, here's that very word. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited and presented by Thos Ribbits, who was in the company of Thomas F Arnold. Copyright Musical Talk 2020, except for the songs, where the copyright remains with the creators. And my enormous thanks to Tom for allowing me to play his songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at MusicalTalk Thos.
But Mark Watson... no, sorry, let me do that again. That was rubbish.